So I'll be letting everyone know how they can identify Tree of Heaven in the spring and summertime so they can report it to IMAP invasives, as well as look for spotted lanternfly nymphs and secondary, third, and even fourth instars on this species that is, like Tom said, very much preferred by the spotted lanternfly. Next slide. So Tree of Heaven has a very similar native range to spotted lanternfly. Central China, Taiwan. It really likes disturbed soils where there's been a lot of human disturbance. So I took that top picture in just like an industrial area next to a building. You'll often see it there growing out of just cracks in the concrete or next to the foundation of a building. It does need a lot of light to grow, so you're not going to see it really in the interior of a forest, but more of an edge species. It doesn't need much water to grow, and in those places that it does like to grow, like next to a foundation, it could actually damage a foundation of building, so you want to try and remove it if you can, if you're concerned about something like that. It can crowd out native species with its dense canopy, and it also will release some chemicals from its roots that change the soils to make it more hospitable for more Tree of Heaven to grow. So these are just some interesting facts that might help you remember Tree of Heaven a little better. It was brought over in the 1700s by a gardener, and it was planted in Pennsylvania. It's thought in some arboretums initially. It was also, they attempted to grow silk moths on Tree of Heaven, but I don't think that worked out very well. It was the subject of that novel, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and because it was so prolific there, that's why it was the subject of that book. And you could see on the cover, it's growing out one of its favorite places next to a foundation of a building. That map is a recent screenshot of the positive Tree of Heaven data on IMAP. And you could see that we have a lot of the state covered with Tree of Heaven data reports from the public. But we want to fill in those gaps and also want to get some negative reports in. So that's why I'm giving this presentation today, so we could get more reports in. Tree of Heaven's a large tree, it can get very tall, up to 80 feet. It will spread rhizomously or through its roots, as well as its seeds, which makes it more invasive. And in that top picture, the tall trees are Tree of Heaven, and then there's also a lot of smaller trees in front of it that are also Tree of Heaven that are spreading from the larger tree's roots. And then that bottom picture is just a small sapling you could see, and that'll quickly grow into a tall tree within just a few years. That's part of the reason they call it Tree of Heaven, because it grows so fast upward. Tree of Heaven has an alternate leaf arrangement, which you can definitely see now that we're in late spring, early summer. It's really leafing out now. And alternate leaf arrangement, you can see on the left side of that upper right-hand drawing of different leaf arrangements. It's so the leaves won't be just right opposite each other on a branch. They'll kind of be staggered up and down it. Tree of Heaven's leaves are pinnately compound, which you can see examples of different compound leaves, or not compound leaves. A simple leaf isn't a compound leaf in that upper right-hand drawing. So that's something to look for when trying to identify Tree of Heaven is the pinnately compound leaf. The leaflet shape for Tree of Heaven is very distinct. It's got a smooth margin, meaning the edges of the leaves don't have teeth. They're smooth, straight. but they do have little rounded teeth at the base of each leaf. There could be anywhere from 1 to 4 on the base of a leaf. And you can see that in the red circle that I have on those photos. And that's a really important identifying factor this time of year for Tree of Heaven. There's also a gland at those teeth or lobes on the leaflets, which emits an odor. I think some people say it can smell like corn chips. I don't know. It doesn't smell that great, in my opinion. So that's something to look for. If you crush the leaf, you could really smell it. Now that the weather is getting warmer, Tree of Heaven will start flowering. The flowers aren't that noticeable in the environment. They're just kind of small and white, nothing too showy. And the Tree of Heaven is dioecious, meaning that there are male and female individuals. You won't find male and female flowers on the same tree. They'll be on separate trees. And they're not super easy to tell apart without getting really close up to the flower with a hand lens. So that's not something to worry about. But if you see these white flowers in conjunction with other identifying features, then you know you have Tree of Heaven. The seeds, which will appear later in the summer, are very showy, and they'll go from green to this pink yellow color, which really stands out when you're just driving along the highways and you see it. The seeds will eventually turn brown later in the fall and persist through the winter, where they'll eventually fall out and plant more Tree of Heaven. The pith is an identifying factor all year round. It's a soft, spongy texture and has a distinct smell of burnt peanut butter. So you can just cut or break open a twig if you're not sure if it's Tree of Heaven and look for this pith. The smell is more noticeable during the warmer weather rather than when it's colder out. So that's something to look for this time of year if you want to identify Tree of Heaven. The bark is an identifying feature all year round. Some people describe it as cantaloupe skin because it's got these white lines in it, kind of like some melons do. And that's always helped me remember it. It doesn't take long for the bark to acquire that lightly furrowed white striping, but the really new saplings and growth will have more of a texture like on the far right photo of that thin sapling, where it's kind of just a light brown color, maybe even a little tinge of green with small dots. Those are the lenticels on it. And you will see a lot of new growth this time of year with that type of bark as well. So we are still seeing some of this early growth on Tree of Heaven in late spring, and it has this kind of brown color to it when the leaves are first starting to unfurl. And that's definitely something to look for, especially if you keep chopping it down during spring yard work and it keeps trying to grow back. You'll see this brown color to the very, very new leaves. Now I have that the twig is the most identifying feature during winter, but it can actually be an identifying feature all year round. So this is something you would want to take a picture of if you're submitting a report to IMAP. The leaf scar on the twig is very distinct. It's kind of heart-shaped. Its bud is just above that heart shape, and then it has a bunch of dots going along the bottom of the heart, which are the vascular bundles for the leaf. On the right, I have some comparisons to its lookalike twigs, because there are other heart-shaped leaf scars on twigs, even of trees that have other features that look like tree of heaven, walnut especially. But you can see the terminal bud at the end of that twig is very different than tree of heaven's terminal bud. Sumac, which is another lookalike of tree of heaven and grows in a lot of the same spaces. Its leaf scar is slightly different because its bud is directly in the center of it, which I'll talk about more later. But you can see the difference between tree of heaven and sumac there. It's tree of heaven's twig and branches and just the whole tree gets a lot larger. And then there's horse chestnut, whose leaf scar on the twig is heart-shaped and looks similar, but again has a very different terminal bud on the end of the twig. It'll be a very large bulbous bud. So as I was saying, sumac is a lookalike of tree of heaven. It has pinnately compound leaves like tree of heaven, but the leaves are serrated and definitely don't get quite as large as tree of heaven. The tips of sumac's branches will have its fruit or flowers on it that look like red cones. There atop you could see what they look like without leaves on the tree, which is going to tell you that that's definitely sumac and not tree of heaven. It has those red tufts on the end of the branches. That bottom photo is just a closer look at sumac's twig, which is pretty distinct. That photo all the way on the right shows where tree of heaven and sumac can grow right in the same spaces, both like disturbed soils. So the taller trees are tree of heaven in the background, and then right in front is sumac. So you can see why you might get them mixed up sometimes. Next slide. Here's another look at sumac's leaf, just trying to show that serrated edge of the leaflets on the leaf. You can see they have little teeth all around. Next slide. Here's another easy way to tell the difference between tree of heaven and sumac this time of year is when you break a leaf off, tree of heaven will have a clear sap that isn't really visible in these photos, and then sumac has a milky white sap when you break off a leaf, and that's a good way to tell the difference when you're trying to identify tree of heaven. Next slide. Another lookalike is walnut, which, like Tom was saying, is a preferred host of the early spotted lanternfly nymphs. You could see that heart-shaped bud scar on that second photo but it also has that kind of like a monkey face smile on the bottom of it, which tree of heaven won't have. You could also see the terminal bud, and if it has those green balls anywhere near it, that would probably be later in the summer. You'll know that that's definitely black walnut and not tree of heaven, because tree of heaven does not have a fruit like that. Here I put ash up because to the untrained eye, ash's pinnately compound leaves might look like tree of heaven, but ash's leaves will only get around 7 leaflets on green and white ash, when tree of heaven will get a lot more leaflets, a longer leaf, which is a good way to tell the difference between the two. So we'll continue to encourage everyone to check their trees, especially if they know they have tree of heaven around where they're at. Keep looking for the early instar nymphs and eggs, and report them to IMAP Invasives when you find them. Thank you.